Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we're speaking with Seattle poet Susan Landgraf. She has published more than 400 poems, essays, and articles in journals, magazines, and newspapers. Her poems have appeared in Prairie Schooner, Poet Lore, Margie, Nimrod, Bellingham Review, The Laurel Review, and Plowshares, among many others. Her full-length poetry collection, What We Bury, Changes the Ground, was published by T-Bot Bach in 2017. She also published a chapbook, Other Voices and Student Reflection, Journal for Student Success, with Prentice Hall. She's given more than 150 writing workshops, including, most recently, the San Miguel Writers Conference, Centrum, here in Port Townsend, the Marine and Science Technology Center, and Kahini in Jamaica. Honors include Pablo Neruda, Society of Humanistic Anthropology and Academy of American Poets Awards, a Theodore Morrison Scholarship at Breadloaf, and residencies at, among others, Hedgebrook, Ragdale, Willard R. Espy, and most recently, Willapa Bay Air in April of 2018. A former journalist, she taught writing, media, literature, and diversity and globalism classes at Highline College for 27 years. She also taught at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in 2002, 2008, 2010, and 2012 through an exchange between Highline and that town. A book of writing exercises is forthcoming from Two Sylvias Press, and Susan, the tireless Susan Landgraf, is currently serving as Auburn, Washington's Poet Laureate, a 3-year appointment. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Thank you, Sheila. It's a delight.
I'm glad you're here. And if I mispronounced any names and places you've taught, as we get to those places, you can say them the way they should be said. And one of the things I know about you personally, and also from the bio I just read, is what a very long career you've had in poetry. And I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about the journey from when you started to today, when you've begun to serve your 3-year term as Auburn's Poet Laureate. The ups and downs of those years as a poet, maybe things that were instrumental in your learning as you went along. It's a big task, but just dive in anywhere.
Books saved my life when I was a kid. I came out of a violent, abusive childhood. Thank goodness for my grandparents. They actually saved me in many ways, but it was books. I went to them not knowing that my family was necessarily different than any others. Maybe it wasn't, but books gave me another world. So I delved into books way back, and when I think I was 14 when I wrote Pearl S. Buck and Taylor Caldwell. Both of them at that time were women I admired, and their writing as well, of course. They both wrote back to me, personal letters, typed on a typewriter, but signed with their names. Because what I said was, I want to be a writer when I grow up. And they essentially said, well, and so you will be. And so that's what I aspired to be, had children, and of course when I would try to write, and then it was fiction, that's what I was writing, they didn't want to take their naps. So the writing kind of bumbled along until I took a writing class at a community college. And I won't say the college, and I won't give the person's name, the teacher's name, but I was stunned when I got a C in her class. And when I asked why, she said, I don't give anything less than a C. And then she said, and you might think about why you're taking up space in this class.
Whoa. So, Susan, back up. You mean she didn't give D's and F's?
She didn't give anything lower. Yeah, she didn't give anything lower.
So you basically failed in her eyes.
And why was I taking up space?
How did you respond to her is what I'm asking.
Well, I sobbed my way home. And my husband, bless him, he said, maybe she doesn't like you. And I thought, well, why is that the case? She said, you're trying to think about important things, but really, you should write just kind of humorous little anecdotal things. That's about where you should be writing. So I managed, finally, I stayed long enough. I don't know why, persistence, that would be one of my terms I'd call myself. I stayed until I got an A in her class, and then I thought, you know what? There are other writing classes surely somewhere. So I found Lonnie Kaneko at Highline, signed up for his class. It wasn't for credit. He said, okay, here's the schedule of what you're all going to be writing in this class, which included poems. And I said to him, I hate poetry. I don't like it. And he said, well, you're going to write, I think it was 2 poems in the class. And then, lo and behold, I became a poet.
I love that. So
I know.
You've got good advice from the 2 fiction writers that you had written to as a little girl, and you got good advice from him. And many, many writers, it turns out, share that experience with an early teacher or someone in college who said to them, you have no business writing. Choose another career. Right. So you had the echo of that, and so you shall be, which is so wonderful that you had that in your ears from when you were young. And so you are. So once you started being a poet, something changed. You understood poetry. What made you like it now?
I had to write poems. I think what I did was hand them to him sort of like, well, here, you asked for them. And they were terrible because I hadn't read poetry beyond what I'd been forced to in school. So it was my connection with Lonnie and his class. But then at about the same time, I found a book at my children's school, one of their book sales, by Carl Sandburg called Honey and Salt. And I read that book and thought, oh, this is poetry? It was like my head burst wide open. 3 years after I took Lonnie's class, we'd kept in touch, and I did a reading at Carco Theater with he and James Mitsui. And it was sort of like, okay, this is something I am now. And it took me a while to be able to say, I am a writer, I am a poet, but I truly believe in the exercise book that you mentioned that's coming out from Two Sylvias. I talk about the fact that I know there are people who say poetry doesn't change your life, but like Gregory Orr said, it did change his life, and I think it did change my life. It saved my life as well, and continues to do so. Well, it's a way for me to be conscious of the world, and I think that makes me a better person, too.
I don't think poetry can help but change our lives because poetry tells us truths, real, yes, deep truths. It's a one thing to sort of bury them. It's another thing to find them. And every time you find them, you change. And you know that firsthand. Absolutely my experience and that of so many other people, that you don't know where you're going when you write a poem. And where you've gone turns out to be someplace really significant. And my own belief is that you've really arrived at that someplace significant when what you've written reaches the hearts and minds of someone else. There's a difference between the work that can be read by others and deliver that exploration and insight to them, and work that's almost there but not really, where a lot of people stop. They feel just good enough to have done that, and maybe that doesn't change lives, but the work that reaches other people through centuries. I mean, you and I have both read poems that have changed our lives that were written hundreds of years ago.
Well, and even longer.
Yeah.
Afis and Levi and so many. And I think that's been part of my journey, too, to find poets from other cultures. And though translation never gives really exactly the same poem as is written in its native language, but still it gives us a chance to visit those cultures.
Absolutely.
And
words. We'll get to the talking about it, but you visited other cultures quite a bit, according to your bio. So perhaps this would be a time to read the poems from your book.
Okay.
And let's repeat the title of the book, please.
It's called What We Bury Changes the Ground. I'll read 2 of them. The first is a prose poem, and it's called The Woodshed. I liked the smell of wood stacked like walls inside walls, but there was something else, a metallic smell. When I was brave, I ran in, counted the seconds I stayed with my feet planted in the dirt. 5, 6 seconds before I was out with the bees, buzzing my grandmother's roses. One day, I bet myself I could go in and pull the door shut. When the outside latch dropped with a metal click, I stood while my skin crawled up my back. Slivers of light under the door needled the walls. And there he was, with wicked eyes that looked like twin flashlights. The priest had talked about evil. I smelled evil. I heard evil breathing. I knew he was searching for an axe. He was going to lift it up and bring it down, just like Graham killed her chickens. 1 minute they were pecking for corn. The next they were running around without their heads. She laid them down. She held them with her left hand. She raised the axe with her right. Blood splayed and fell like rain. I remembered Christ dying on the cross, but I wouldn't rise again. I was wetting my pants. When my grandmother screeched the shed door open, I ran to the rectangle of light and burrowed into her apron. I'll try to be good, I promised. I will try to be very, very good.
Oh, Susan. I mean, what a huge story, and it all so concisely set in that place that you're writing of. What would Lonnie Konenko say, do you think, about this poem?
He was gone by the time my book came out. And I'll just interject, Lonnie played a huge role in my life, not only as my teacher and as a fellow poet, but I mentioned that I kept in touch with him, he kept in touch with me, and once a year usually I'd go in and talk to his classes. And then he's the one who called and said, Susan, there's a job at Highline that I think is your job. He didn't get the job for me, but if he hadn't called me and told me, I wouldn't have then become his colleague. And the mentor again he was as I became a teacher. But I think Lonnie would say, that's good. I think he'd say, good imagery, strong verbs. Yeah, I think he'd say it was good. I'd maybe even get an A.
Oh, off the charts, eh? But I just said that because of when you said the image is deep in my mind now that you handed him the poems, like, well, here, in that first class. And so I'm sure he'd say, Susan, here. And I can hear that almost coming from his mouth. Here, this is it. This is great. Fabulous work. And you have another one from that book?
Yes, and this one ends the collection. It's why Jules Verne wanted to find the center of the earth. At the edge of a marsh, those mired places with detached clumps of sedge and life under the scum. Hear the muck sucking to connect ankle bones and gastropods. Inland, marble markers lean with the ages in the cemeteries of Kent and Cleveland. On the coast, the beach wears the stunted pilings of a pier, leftovers from the era of sporty gentlemen and ladies with their parasols against the sun before the tsunami hit. Tonight, beachcombers will feed log after log into a conflagration, a brief illumination. What an act it is daily to rise, to put on one shoe after the other, bras, sarongs, crutches, and briefcases, to walk the land, waiting to take us back.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Seattle poet Susan Landgraf about her books of poetry and how she came to writing poetry and then to teaching others to write poems.
I'm kind of without words here, listening to how you go from something very specific to something very huge and universal. That's what the best poetry does. So I love your lists in there. Briefcase, well, I think it said crutches and briefcases were the ending of one list. And
bras and sarongs.
You just bring so much of the world in through those very specific images and through listing. And I know some of your other work, and some of it's short poems, and these are longer, and by a lot, I think. And I'm wondering how you've seen maybe some development in your work, or go back and forth between short lyrical poems and longer, more narrative poems. Do you have anything to say about that?
I do. Most of the poems in this collection tend to be longer. I can't say I write every morning, but I'd say I write 340 or so mornings of the year, maybe more. And when you said we don't know where we're going, I start out without knowing where I'm going. Something comes. I long ago told my students there's no such thing as writer's block. I believe that. I think everybody can write. It's whether or not it makes sense and whether it's good. But there's always stuff to write about, at any rate. I go back and forth. Some of them are longer. I sometimes edit them to the point where I think I've edited too much. But last year, Kestrel took 2 of my poems. The one poem was 6 stanzas, and the editor wrote back and said, I'm almost embarrassed to ask you this, but I think that you should take out the middle 4 stanzas. I think the poem is the first and the last stanza. And I kind of went gulp, and then decided I'd wait till the morning, and I'd word process it per just the first and last stanza and see what I thought. And she was absolutely right. It didn't need those stanzas in between. But at times I've gone back and realized that, no, there needs to be something else put in that needs to backtrack or needs to come up with a new point that seems pertinent. And I also realized that I need to revise. I revise a lot. And sometimes I feel like other people just kind of write their poems and they go out in the world. But I know that that's also not true.
Can I intercept here that a poem is supposed to look like it happened just like that? So that fools us a lot. We read books, beautiful poetry, and we think, well, mine doesn't look like that when I sit down in the morning to write. And
no.
I started writing seriously about just before 1980, I guess. And it was new in that decade, 1980, even in the 90s, suddenly there were these books where poets were contributing early drafts and revisions and allowing people to see what happened. And that was, for me, a lifesaver because I went, oh, I'm like them. It's not that I'm not like them, more like them than not. And that was such a boost. So this question of how a poem arrives, like yours arrived in a first and last stanza with something else in the middle, and then the other ones don't have their middle. And it's a long journey to learning how to find what isn't necessary and find the rest of it that's not there yet. And just knowing that other people writing poetry have experienced this over and over is really, I'm glad you're talking about it because it's really, really helpful to people to know that. But the end product really needs to feel that way of this just came full blown. What was that middle part that was unnecessary? What do you think it was doing there? Did it ever become its own poem?
No, I haven't revisited it. But I recognized that it was going into territory that then I wasn't making more of. The poem itself is called A Prophet's Ear. And the imagery of the ear was all important, but it was about silence as well as talk. And really, I only needed both of those. I didn't need to go into anything more.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think our educated brain intercedes and goes, oh, yeah, you could write more here. Let's see. Just like a teacher would ask you to write more somewhere. And
yeah. You only wrote 25 words. I asked you to write 60.
Right. And the poetry brain says, the images are delivering. So thank you for that discussion.
I just might mention, by the way, that Bruce Beasley gave a craft lecture at Centrum this year on revisions. And he used, and I'll just mention two of the poets he used Yeats and Elizabeth Bishop. And the early drafts that they had compared to the drafts that have ended up becoming very famous, such a startling shift. Mm-hmm. It was great to be able to look at them.
Sometimes we just have to speak on the page until something clicks and we're in flow and the actual poetry is coming. But the first drafts can look kind of weird. I've seen an early draft of The Art of Losing, if that was the one he used from Bishop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It's like the worst journal writing you might write. And it's kind of embarrassing, I'm sure, if she were alive, to know this is out in public. But it's so helpful to see where the poems, the spark was that she found and then wrote the beautiful poem that we all know, The Art of Losing, the Villanelle. As a longtime teacher at Highline Community College and at Centrum and now Kahini and other places, and please say the name of the place in China where you taught.
Shanghai Jiao Tong University.
Great. Much better than I said it. Do you see differences between the poets in training, the new poets you're working with, and our generation of poets?
I do, and I try to write more like some of what's being published. I don't know how good they are.
What does that mean, some like the ones being published now?
Well, where there seems to be lots of fingers out there, and there's something that connects them, but when I read what others have written, some of them, I'm thinking, oh, this is a great use of language, and oh my, they're really stretching. But then I think, but I don't get the kernel. And that's not all of them, certainly not. Like Terence Hayes, I would say he's more a modern poet. And at first it was like, wait, I'm running fast, but I can't seem to catch up with you. But the more I've read him, the more I see the multiple layers, and he's talked about that too, that there are many layers. And so maybe it's just the need to become more familiar with this almost disassociation that somehow becomes a poem. And so I'm trying to imitate that, but I don't know that I feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah, I think that we come from different times, and our way of expressing, even our relationship to our time now, can be really different than people who've come up, what's our future versus our past. Yeah. So thank you for that. I get that feeling. I've been co-judge with Kelly Aganon for a contest each year in honor of Paula Jones Gardner.
Right.
And each year, the poems that are submitted seem to me more different than they are alike to the kind of poems that we were writing way back when in prehistory, right? So you've answered the question of what are you working on now? You're working on perhaps experimenting with this style that you've said has lots of fingers out there that somehow come together. And is this work becoming a book?
Not that work so much, but 2 years ago, I think I did the first run on a book called The Warden's Daughter. And I'm re-looking it now because I think I'm ready to tweak it and twirl it and see what needs to be added or maybe what needs to be taken out. That was my first experience with persona poems on an extended basis. And so that's different, and I'm kind of trying to redo that. And I've put it together and sent out something called Death in the Suburbs, which was about the neighborhood, well, the suburbs that we lived in when my children were growing up. And those years and people's lives, there were many deaths of many kinds. I also just, when I had the residency at Willapa Bay in April, got together 2 chapbooks, one called Journey of Trees that I think is finished. It's out there. We'll see.
Really want to have time for you to read the poem that is recently published or recently taken. Tell us a little bit about it, and then please read it.
This poem took a while. This is one of those where it got tweaked and tweaked and tweaked. Prairie Schooner took it, and one of my longest poems called The First 6 Years of the Green River Murders that I worked on for more than 20 years, I think, so, and it's long. But they also took this one, which is short, and it's called Birdman, and I'd read about a man who collected feathers. They were everywhere, and this is what this poem is about. Birdman. The morning before he died, he went to the rooftop, bags full. Feathers had poked out of his pockets, veined the pages of his books, lined the staircase, years of gull, finch, macaw, peacock, crow. Some 25% of birds had died during the Pleistocene. Had he studied beaks, wings, bones, and their relationship to dinosaurs? Had he run his fingers daily over the barbs, which bear barbels, which in turn bear barbicels in a continuous vein, to feel the wind in his blood? As he raised his arms again and again, and the sky turned a rainbow of green, black-tipped, blue, and white horny epidermal outgrowths, did he believe in transmigration, or was it envy?
A wonderful last line.
And I really wondered that. Is that what we feel?
I can feel that you really wondered that very strongly. And thank you for that one. So we just have a very few minutes, and I want to congratulate you on becoming, I think it's Auburn's 3rd Poet Laureate? Fourth. I'm sure that you have plans for how you're going to be involved or help the community be involved in poetry over the next 3 years. Maybe you could just give us 1 or 2 of your ideas.
I want to go into the schools. I used to do that when I was poet in residence. I did that east of the mountains for a number of weeks. And I want to go into the schools and do something with poetry there. I also have talked to the president, Suzanne Johnson of Green River Community College, and I want to see what we can do there because Green River is in Auburn. I want to do some community kinds of readings and writing workshops, making use of people in our own community. I talked to Claudia Castro Luna, our new state poet laureate, so she is willing to do something in Auburn. So I think just trying to get out and talk to people, give workshops, and have people give readings, and then try to find people who both love poetry and how amazing that Auburn has a poet laureate, but also people who maybe think they don't like poetry and, accidentally find that they might.
Well, just like you.
Like me,
so you're
yes.
exactly the right person to do that. Well, I wish you so many good wishes on this, I think, very comprehensive program that's going to, I think, keep you quite busy for 3 years.
I think it will, and I do want to be busy with it. I really do want to do a good job. I want to say, too, Sheila, that this has been a long process. We had talked about that briefly in our own personal conversation. But, I'm old. I don't feel old, but the years say I am. So it's been a long time. Apparently I work slowly, but I am grateful for all that has come into my life, including people like you and all the others who are my family, even though not by blood.
Oh, thank you, Susan. And it's very important when you're a writer to find your tribe and feel connected. I'm not convinced you work slowly. Maybe some of the poems took a while, and we all have some that are harder than others. But 400 publications of pieces, books, more books coming out there, work as a poet laureate. I'm not thinking you're slow. I'm thinking you're tenacious, like you said at the beginning, committed and full of life. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Sheila, so much. I appreciate it a lot.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.